We arrived in the Bay of Algiers on Christmas morning 1942, dressed in our white tropical uniforms and eager to see the new exotic country. Squinting against the scorching sun, we gazed at the white townhouses and villas scattered along the hillsides. Soon we saw the familiar silhouette of the Maidstone, fresh from Gibraltar. We transmitted identification signals and immediately received a reply, "Welcome to Algiers, Merry Christmas, all shore leave is cancelled." We were shocked at such an inhospitable welcome, but the reason for this soon became clear. Admiral Darlan had been killed the day before our arrival, and no one knew how the local French would take the news. Fortunately, nothing much happened, and by evening we were allowed to go ashore. On shore, I was met with exciting news. It turned out that I was recalled to England to study at the commander's course. Tony Spender, with whom we had once been in basic training together, had received the same order. We were to go home on a cruiser, which was expected to leave in a few days. After doing some simple calculations, we realized that we would have no more than 2 free days in England before school started. Spender had a brilliant idea. For the past few months, he had been a senior mate on a submarine, the P-219, doing some special assignments for the Americans. In October, they took General Mark Clark to Algeria for a secret meeting with Giraud's representatives, and returned safely a few days later. They then took aboard General Giraud himself, who had fled France, and boarded a seaplane that later took the general to Eisenhower in Gibraltar. Through his new American friends, Spender contacted the pilot of a flying fortress that was leaving for England in 3 days and arranged for us to be taken aboard as passengers. Our commanders were horrified. In those days, air transportation was considered too dangerous to carry passengers. In recent times, so many high-ranking military officers have died precisely during air travel. And didn't Churchill say recently that one submarine commander is worth £1 million sterling? Barney Fawkes, who was too busy to argue, declared that he preferred to know nothing of our plans. We quickly packed up and I bid farewell to the Saracen, its captain and crew. A few months later, the Saracen was hit by depth bombs off Sicily. The boat was badly damaged and had to be resurfaced. The crew abandoned ship and surrendered. Lambie remained in the control room until the last minute and sank the boat himself. He managed to get to the bridge at the very last moment. The next day, Spender and I reported to the American airfield near Algiers. The rains had recently fallen, and the entire field, except for the runways, was a swamp. In several places this swamp was crossed by narrow automobile paths, along which we waded with considerable difficulty, looking for our American friends. We found them in the farthest corner of the field, sitting dejectedly near the landing gear of a giant airplane. It turned out that one of the engines of the left side had failed. The mechanic had been working with it for 2 hours and was very pessimistic. And the weather forecast received from Gibraltar did not inspire optimism. Low clouds and poor visibility were expected, but even if the engine was repaired, which the pilots had great doubts about, we had to wait for an important passenger whose arrival time was unknown. It began to rain again, and we spent the rest of the day wandering aimlessly through the mud. By the evening the weather had not improved, we had not heard anything about the expected VIP, and the engine had not been repaired. We had to pack up our belongings, return to Algiers, and look for a place to sleep. We decided not to return to Maidstone, where everyone would laugh at us, and our superiors might change their minds and not allow us to fly. We agreed to spend the night on one of the merchant ships and had a good evening in a bar. Later it turned out that our instincts had not failed us. The Maidstone received a message that we had not arrived in Gibraltar. It caused a real panic. Nobody knew what had happened. The plane crashed on the way or didn't make it. Fortunately, we didn't know about it. We had an early breakfast and waited a long time for the car that was to take us to the airfield. The sky was densely covered with clouds that seemed like you could reach up with your hand. When we reached the airport an hour later, we resigned ourselves to the thought of an inevitable return to Maidstone. To our surprise, when we pulled up to the flying fortress, all of its engines were humming smoothly. Moreover, the weather forecast from Gibraltar turned out to be favourable, and the VIP passenger called and said that he would arrive at the plane within an hour. Half an hour later, a car pulled up, out of which stepped a captain and General Browning, who later commanded the Air Force at Arnhem and now came from the Tunisian front. We got into the plane, the pilot slowly taxied to the beginning of the runway, the roar of the engines grew stronger, the plane picked up speed and lifted off the ground. The General and Captain were seated in the tail of the plane, and Spender and I sat in the cockpit with whom we had already met and found common ground. At first we flew along the African coast, then turned steeply south and found ourselves over the blue waters of the Mediterranean. After a few hours, the navigator announced that we were close to our destination and began to look for landmarks. "Here we are," he said, and pointed to a rocky peninsula that appeared in the misty haze. The pilot began to descend. Spender and I stared at the scene before us for a moment, then looked at each other in bewilderment. The cliff we were flying toward was an unusual shape, different from what we were used to, and it faced south instead of north. For a while anxiety struggled with good breeding, and we kept quiet. But soon we spotted another mountain peak in the distance and recognized the familiar outline. There was no mistake. Convinced that we were right, we showed the navigator the real Gibraltar. He was not the least bit embarrassed. "I think you are right," he agreed at once. "Take 35 degrees to the right, Captain." Thus we saved ourselves and General Browning from landing at Ceuta and internment in Spanish Morocco for the rest of the war. Landing in Gibraltar on a flying fortress is not for the faint-hearted. The landing strip runs east-west across the narrow isthmus between Gibraltar and La Linea. During the war, it was extended on one side by building an embankment into the sea so that fortresses could take off and land here. But still, the giant machines had to touch the ground a few yards from the beginning of the landing strip to avoid crashing into the sea on the other side. We flew over the airfield to determine the wind direction, then made a circle over the city and came in for a landing. The shadow of the fortress, a giant fish, glided across the blue water where we so often swam. The eastern end of the landing strip was approaching, in our opinion, too fast. At one point we thought we were about to die, but the pilot turned out to be a master of his craft, and in a few minutes we were already putting our smiling faces to the warm sun. Having agreed to return to the airport the next morning at 7 o'clock, we went to the headquarters to report on our arrival. Here the waves of Superior's anger fell on us in full force, and it was Admiral Cunningham himself who poured it on us. We were forbidden to fly further and ordered to wait for the Scylla, which would arrive in Gibraltar in 2 days. It was on this ship that we were to sail from the start, so the Fortress landed the next day in England without us. But we were still ahead of schedule and had an unexpected opportunity to have some fun along the way. Scylla was supposed to enter the Atlantic and head for the mouth of the River Clyde along the north coast of Ireland at an economical speed, but we had only been going from Gibraltar for 24 hours when a German was sighted from the Sunderland going into the Bay of Biscay. The Scylla received orders from the Admiralty to intercept the vessel. We took a course to the northeast and, despite the bad weather, greatly increased speed. On the second day at dusk, we spotted an enemy merchant vessel. An hour later, it would manage to get away, disappearing into the night. 2 shells were enough for the ship to stop and lower the lifeboats. It was decided to sink it with torpedoes. The 2 submarine passengers were surprised and amused when the first of the torpedoes fired at the stationary target missed. The second hit the target and made a hole in the centre section of the hull, after which the enemy vessel sank. Having deviated from the established route, the Scylla arrived at Greenock 2 days ahead of schedule. Spender and I caught the overnight train to London, intending to make good use of the 4-day vacation. On a gloomy Sunday evening in mid-January, I arrived in Portsmouth and took the ferry to the Dolphin. Here I met up again with Spender and other old friends, Mike Willoughby, Freddie Sherwood, Phil May and Jimmy Lunders. We all had to learn how to command submarines, but Mike was sent on this course just 18 months after starting his submarine service. A unique case. The course we attended was once called Periscope School, and some joker had renamed it the Dummy School. Now it was officially called KKK, Commander's Qualification course, but we were all still dorks by tradition. The first 2 weeks of the 6-week course we lived on the Dolphin at Fort Blockhouse, a kind of bastion at the entrance to Portsmouth Harbour. From here we had a good view of the waters of Spithead all the way to the Isle of Wight. It was bounded on the east by the bay, on the north by the hangars and slips of the Camper and Nicholson shipyard, where yachts had long been built, and from Gosport it was separated from the not very clear waters of Hasler Creek, where there were submarines moored on concrete wharves near the fort walls. By land it was accessible by a single road that followed the narrow isthmus between the sea and Hasler Creek, connecting with the main road to Gosport at Hasler Hospital. The natural geographical isolation of the place in wartime was reinforced by posts on the road. Each morning after an excellent breakfast we cadets walked to the west gate of the fort, then along the road, driven by a fresh breeze from the sea, turned right, past the giant tank where novice submariners learned to use Davis apparatus, and came to a small brick building where we were taught how to attack enemy ships. The attack teacher was an elaborate and meticulously designed simulator, a war game that allowed us to make elementary mistakes without irreparable consequences. The building was 2 stories high. On the top floor, accessed by an outside staircase, was a pad room. In the far corner was a movable platform with a small turntable in the middle to display a training target that moved on rails. At the opposite end of the room was a large white plastic paving table divided into squares on a scale of 1,000 yards to the inch. Women from the auxiliary building operated the mechanisms that moved the target. Racks set along the walls displayed small models of warships from all the warring powers: battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and passenger and cargo ships. On the bottom floor of the building, the interior of an attacking submarine was faithfully recreated. Imagine for a moment that you are a spectator in this room and it is my turn to lead the attack. The round white room where I am standing is the submarine's control room, although it looks different in reality. The periscope leads upward into the pad room. Its upper lenses are closed for now, as preparations are underway to launch the attack. Unseen from my seat, Commander Teddy Woodward, our instructor, sets the new model ship on a moving platform. As the attack progresses, the target moves slowly toward the periscope, pivoting on the platform as the submarine's course changes. Her movements Commander Woodward has planned in advance, and they are automatically repeated on the laying table. My tactical decisions will also be mirrored on the pad table by members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, who follow the commands I give over the intercom. Around me are other course participants. They are waiting for their turn to lead the attack and perform duties that, when I become submarine commander, will be handled by other officers. One of them stands beside me and reads the angles and bearing on which I set the periscope, and he also helps me to identify the target, as he has numerous reference books at his fingertips. The other works on a fruit machine, where he inputs the information I give him about bearing, declination, mast height, and heading angle. The clever machine processes the data received and gives out the actual bearing, course, and distance in yards. This information will be relayed to the navigator, who marks the course of the attack on the map and calculates the speed of the target. Suddenly, a voice comes over the intercom, suggesting that I take action. Control room, you are a T-class submarine on patrol in the North Sea, course 145. Are you ready? Attack, attack. I repeat to start the countdown and command, raise periscope. Now the upper lenses of the periscope are open, which should mean the periscope is up. I look through the eyepieces and immediately recognize the familiar silhouette of the notorious Scharnhorst, coming straight at me. Though it may be a merchant ship or even a submarine, coming at such an angle that it is not immediately recognizable. But I must act. How am I to get into an attacking position? For the next few weeks our heads were occupied solely with finding answers to this question. We spent many hours every day on the simulator, leading an attack or being part of an attacking team. We started with simple attacks in which the target followed a constant course from start to finish, and then moved on to more complex cases with targets that zigzagged. Sometimes, if you kept the periscope up too long in the final stages of a heavy attack, you could hear heavy thumps and a loud cracking noise overhead. That was the room upstairs throwing heavy objects at the metal pavement, which meant the target had rammed you. After each attack was completed, we would go upstairs to see if the target had been sunk and listen to Teddy Woodward perform a drill debriefing. There were bad days when unsuccessful attacks came one after another. At the same time, our already bad mood was worsened by the thought that we were still operating in ideal conditions. Visibility was excellent, the waves were not flooding the periscope lenses, the storm was not covering the target with a veil of rain and spray, and there were no navigational hazards, which are not unavoidable when operating in shallow water. If you show complete helplessness in ideal conditions, when people's lives do not depend on your decisions and your actions are theoretical, what will happen in real life? How many times during my studies I thought I was wasting my time, and Teddy Woodward has already made sure that I will not be able to finish the course, only so far he hides it from me. On the last day of the simulator class, we had the opportunity to have some fun. Something unimaginable was going on in the upper room. Targets were moving backwards, flipping, stopping abruptly, or even disappearing. One of the attacks was led by Teddy Woodward, and his target burst into flames before he could fire a shot. And lastly, we swapped places with the girls from the auxiliary corps. They steered the boat and we manipulated the targets. I must admit that we were very impressed with the results they achieved. After that, we packed up and, accompanied by Teddy Woodward, headed north to Rothesay, a town on the estuary of the River Clyde. There, the sea part of our training was planned. We were accommodated ashore at the Glenbourne Hotel, but were obliged to arrive at the Cyclops by breakfast time. Each morning we got up, dressed in the dark, and set out for the mothership. The joyless February dawn came when we, having finished our meal, climbed the gangways to the submarine, where the final part of our training took place. It was our old acquaintance, the Sea Lion. After I went ashore at Blyth, the boat made 2 more trips to the Bay of Biscay under the command of Douglas Lambert. She had done a good job, and it was sad to see a strong warhorse determined on peaceful work. She was now commanded by Lieutenant Verschoyle Campbell. Each day we took turns as captain to learn the skills of putting the submarine to sea, diving and surfacing in a given area, and returning to base. I'll describe one day. The first captain of the day was Phil May, the oldest of the knuckleheads. While he was giving orders, manoeuvring, switching from electric motors to diesel engines, lying down on a constant course and speed to enter the specified area, we stood on the bridge and entertained ourselves with conversations. After a short time, the penetrating cold drove us into the cosy warmth of the wardroom, where we were comfortably seated at the table. Under the dim light of a swinging lamp, we began a game of poker. Little by little, the thundering diesels took us to the area between the islands of Bute and Arran that had been established for training. About an hour after leaving the harbour, the command sounded, "Ready for dive 5 minutes." A telegraph jingled, transmitting to the engine room the order to slow down, and the rumble of the 16 cylinders gradually subsided into a barely audible whisper. Then came another command, and the crew took their seats. The telegraph rang again, which this time meant the order to stop the diesels, and there was silence. We, lazily lounging in the wardroom, found the role of passengers quite amusing. We could hear the preparations for the dive, and we knew that it was a little different in life. We had all recently returned from combat tours, where diving is usually done without a howler. When a sharp buzzer sounded on the submarine, we stopped the game and watched the depth gauge arrow move. When it crept to 30 feet and froze her, we continued the game. The excitement was no longer felt here, so the lamp was no longer dangling overhead, but hanging motionless. The only sounds that broke the silence were the quiet words of the XO, checking the trim, and the barely audible slurping of a pumping water out of one of the trim tanks. Then came the voice of the navigator calling the bearing of the shore landmarks necessary to determine the exact position of the ship, and the telegraph rang, transmitting the order to the engine room. The XO was satisfied with the trim and ordered the speed to be reduced to the minimum. The propellers were now turning faintly, keeping the boat at a speed that would allow her to obey the rudder. And our game was in full swing. Everything was very peaceful and quiet. We were waiting for the target to appear. Pretty soon the order was given to prepare for the first attack. We went to the brightly lit control room. The target had just passed the Cumbrae lighthouse and was heading towards us. Phil May stood at the periscope watching the training target raise the signal flags, announcing the attack. We prepared to perform the duties of submarine officers that we had become accustomed to during our training. The fruit machine, located at the forward bulkhead, was ready for use. We all knew how to handle it. The navigational matters were also not new. All that remained was to get a feel for what pipes and valves we would bang our heads against as we fussed about the gasket table. Only the man at the periscope, waiting for his first attack to begin, felt an element of novelty in what was happening. After an hour, the first attack was over, and it was my turn to take my place at the periscope. The others returned to the wardroom to continue the game, and I was left to watch as the training ship reached the edge of the exercise area. There, it would turn around for the next attack. Almost automatically, as I approached the periscope, I made a circular inspection to see if we were too close to the rocky shoreline or if there was a vessel that happened to be approaching us. I took a quick look around the green banks of Butte, noting that the rocky formations were a safe distance away from us, glanced over the entrances to Loch Fane and Kilbrennan Sound, looked around the steep banks of Arran rising nearly 3,000 feet to the top of Gowth Fell. The only ship other than our training target within sight was a small merchant vessel marching down the main channel of the Firth of Clyde. It was about 5 miles from us. Having closed the circle, I returned again to our target, which had so far moved away from us. It was now hardly recognizable against the shore. My heart was pounding as hard as if it were going to pierce my chest and jump out of my chest. The game was over. I was no longer in the simulator, but in a real submarine, which at the moment was about 50 people, and above our heads splashed real seawater. In the coming attack, the target was not a wooden model a few inches in size, but a solid vessel, a large motor yacht White Bear with very beautiful contours, used in wartime as a training target for submarines, as well as an escort ship. At one point I was in a real panic. I found myself having to immediately transform theoretical knowledge into practice. In the attack teacher, we had the opportunity to concentrate fully on tactical issues. Today, Teddy Woodward will evaluate how we put tactics into practice, how we use the periscope, how quickly we make decisions and how accurately we translate them into orders. He will see how proficiently we use tools and instruments, conclude whether we will lose our heads if the situation gets out of control. He'll know if the submarine will get into a dangerous situation because of our inability to assess the factors of time and distance. As I waited for the White Bear to turn, I did not feel confident in my abilities. Suddenly I noticed that the distance between the masts of the yacht was increasing, and after a few seconds I saw her full length. She was turning around. In the calmest voice of which I was capable, I ordered her to prepare for attack. As Teddy Woodward entered the control room, followed by the rest of the goofballs, I made another circular inspection. I wanted to make sure I had enough room to maneuver. Aiming the periscope at the target again, I saw that it was now coming straight at us. Flags were flying on the knock rail indicating the hostile intentions of the target. I announced that we were launching an attack, sincerely hoping my voice didn't shake. And then, "To your stations, attack, bearing, direction. I'm 3 degrees left of the target on the port side. Put the periscope down. Starboard 30-60 feet. Group, full ahead." As the orders sounded, Teddy Woodward glimpsed through the other periscope and made sure I was in control. Then the periscope lowered into its shaft. The helmsman turned the helm and reported, 30 degrees starboard, sir." The telegraph clanked, relaying messages to the engine room. The dive operators set the horizontal rudders so that the boat sank smoothly to the required depth. When the depth gauge hand crept up to the 50-foot mark, they began to adjust the angle of the dive, and at a depth of 60 feet the dive stopped. The submarine shuddered as the propellers pushed her massive hull through the water column at 9 knots. My attack had begun. I approached the fruit machine, noted the data I needed, changed course to get into attack position, and ordered the helmsman to stick to that course. And then, to my considerable surprise, I found that I was not worried at all. It seemed to me that in life everything was even easier than on the simulator. I was in the familiar environment of the control station, where everything around was familiar. In the simulator, the control station had a circular shape, and I had to remember which direction we were moving in all the time. Now I found that there was no need to do mental acrobatics and constantly visualize the position of the target relative to the boat. The discovery seemed very encouraging. After 2 minutes, I ordered a reduction of speed and a climb to periscope depth. The acoustician reported hearing the distant noise of propellers on the target bearing. The boat was ascending to a depth of 32 feet. At 35 feet, I ordered, "Raise the periscope." As the upper lenses penetrated the water column and peered out to the surface, I was already looking through the eyepieces of our little periscope. I had to quickly make sure everything was all right around us and put the periscope away again. Then I rushed to the big, powerful periscope to point it at the target, take bearing, distance, heading angle. After that, I went deeper into the calculation of the attack, occasionally asking short questions of the officers and giving clear and precise orders. At least I hoped they sounded that way. The last order sounded, "First one goes, second one goes." To save time between attacks, we didn't surface, only went up so that the top of the war room showed above the water to indicate the exit of imaginary torpedoes. By means of Aldis's signal lamp from the White Bear, we were told our course and speed. Our signalmen read it by looking through the periscope. And I turned in my watch to Freddie Sherwood, having first called his attention to a small craft that had entered the exercise area during my attack. After that, I retired to the wardroom with peace of mind. Judging by the white tablecloths and the setup, there was going to be a luncheon after Freddie's attack. In the meantime, Teddy Woodward was busy verifying the results of my attack. As the days passed, the attacks became more complex. The target began to move in an alternating course, gradually changing to a complex zigzag. We were then joined by 2 decrepit destroyers that were to play the role of an anti-submarine screen. We had to find a way to deceive the destroyer closest to us or to duck under it. This part of the training process was hectic for Teddy Woodward and Vascoila Campbell. It was hard to resist the temptation to stay at periscope depth until the last moment, hoping to get around the screen and attack quickly. But God forbid if Teddy Woodward signals an emergency dive before you do. You can take risks in real danger, but not in training. In fact, having gone deep to avoid being rammed by the escort ships, you will then have to carefully calculate the moment to surface. Too soon and you'll be hit by a destroyer or pulled to the surface by its tailwind. Too late and you miss your chance to attack the target. In other words, the game was so dangerous that during practice attacks an inviolable rule was imposed. If a submarine went deep, it must stay there until all surface ships were guaranteed to pass. In such exercises, we spent another 3 weeks. Sometimes we stayed in the exercise area until dark and practiced night attacks while remaining on the surface, which was also very difficult. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Inchmarnock Waters area designated for our exercises had no shores, so the polar bear, which was easy to spot against the background of the land, remained invisible to us until it was close by. And even more so in conditions of poor visibility, characteristic of a winter night in the north. But usually at dusk we would return to the Cyclops. Teddy Woodward had only recently started as an instructor. Our group was his first. He was anxious to put as much knowledge into our heads as possible, and felt that we could not do without learning how to attack modern fast warships. So he secured a week's extension and we travelled north to Scapa Flow, the main base of the Metropolitan Fleet. While waiting for the plane, we spent the night in Edinburgh. My memories of that evening are sketchy. I remember the commotion, but I never realised where a live goose had come from in our luggage. Then there were some more adventures at the hotel, ending with us all spending the night together in Filmay's bedroom. The hangover the next morning was truly terrible. I had never felt so bad in my life. It worsened in the afternoon, aided by an unpleasant incident during takeoff. We were safely loaded into a twin-engine Flamingo. The pilot taxied to the beginning of the runway, began to accelerate, opened the throttle, but a few seconds before takeoff, the left engine stalled. The airplane spun desperately in place, and then came to an abrupt stop. We sat there, speechless. The pilot looked back, smiled cheerfully and said he would try again. He started both engines, and it happened again. We thought it was overkill and hurriedly left the plane, which did not want to take off. Teddy Woodward went to arrange for us to be sent some other way. At Scapa Flow, the submarine intruder was placed at our disposal for a week, along with her smiling and friendly Commander Favell. For 4 days we attacked fast destroyers in the training area of Scapa Flow. It was clear from the start that we would gain invaluable experience. After the leisurely attacks on the White Bear speed with which everything happened here, it seemed unreal. But in time we adapted to it, and on the last day even went to the open sea in the area of the Orkney Islands. We were to attack the main force of the Metropolitan Fleet, protected by a screen of destroyers. It was amazing. I remember looking through my periscope at the start of the attack and seeing the 4 times magnified battleship King George V, which about 3 miles away was coming straight at us. Its massive bulk was thrusting heavily and inexorably toward us, and the sea around it was seething and boiling. It was a sight I shall never forget. And the next day we flew back to the south. The training was over. One of the trainees failed the exam, but the rest departed for their vacations to await their destinations. After spending a week in lazy idleness, I received my orders for assignment to the R555. I was to arrive on the Cyclops on March the 23rd. The first person I saw in the wardroom of the Cyclops was Commander Jackie Slaughter. After a thunderous greeting, he offered me a drink, and then, in his usual manner, good-natured, boisterous and cheerful, outlined my programme for the next few weeks. R555 was stationed at Campbelltown, and I was to take over command from Jeremy Nash. Normally 2 or 3 days were given for handing over. I was given a week because I was a former reservist, and the R555 was an old American boat, very different from the boats I had been on. It so happened that the flotilla commander, Captain Edvard, intended to pay a farewell visit to Campbelltown the next morning, and I was ordered to arrive on the old Dutch destroyer Z5 at 9:30 to go with him. In the morning, when we put to sea, a fresh southwesterly wind was blowing. Even in a bay sheltered on all sides, the shallow draught destroyer was rocking quite perceptibly. As we passed Pladda and set course for Campbelltown, the destroyer began to toss with triple the force. I felt an attack of seasickness coming on. Not wanting Captain Edvard to notice my weakness, I chose the most secluded corner on deck and stood there all the way into Campbelltown harbour. There, thank God, it was calm. At the quay, we were met by Commander Caulfield Jenks, the local submarine commander, who had come to greet his commanding officer to show him the local naval facilities for the last time. I bravely reported my arrival and learned that, as I had expected, the boat was at sea on another training exercise and would not return until the evening. It was then with great pleasure that I took a long, solitary walk along the shore. Shortly before 6 o'clock, I returned to the dock. The first to return from the exercise were the surface ships. They were trawlers, as well as steam and motor yachts that had been converted during the war and had become warships. They were fitted with sonar and officers, and lower ranks went to sea to get experience in detecting enemy submarines. I watched them moor at their moorings, and then turned my full attention back to the harbour entrance, waiting for the submarines to show up. R5555 came in first. Describing a wide arc, the boat was approaching the pier and looked very imposing. I immediately noticed that she was much larger and faster than all the old H-class boats that made up the 7th Flotilla. The sailors were already on deck, preparing to perform the usual mooring duties. On the bridge, I recognised the tall, trim figure of Jeremy Nash. The commander was trying to approach the mooring point in a beautiful manner. He had stopped the diesels in advance, and the boat glided through the water until it was opposite the mooring. Here he used the electric motors, and the boat froze a few feet from the pier and strictly parallel to it. The mooring ends flew onto the pier, and in a few minutes the boat was at the dock. Jeremy gave the order. "Stop, car." Then he looked at me with a smile. "Hi, Teddy. Didn't expect you until tomorrow. Come aboard." I walked down the narrow gangway and stepped onto the deck. The young junior lieutenant waiting there saluted me for the first time as commander of the submarine. I was so emotional that I did not immediately remember that I had to respond to the salute. The bow hatch was open. Feeling the curious glances of the sailors on deck, I went down and found that I was in the reserve torpedo room. Waiting for me at the foot of the gangway was a smiling, red-haired Jeremy Nash. After a warm greeting, he took me to the aft wardroom to introduce me to his, or rather my, chief mate Fitzgerald. He was a tall, fair-haired young man with a pleasant, boyish smile. "How are you, sir?" he asked, and I suddenly felt like an imposter. I had never been called sir by any officer before. Here I was, the commanding officer, and I was under the command of this lieutenant, a career sailor who, by virtue of that fact, had every reason to command me, even if I'd been in the submarine fleet a little longer than he had. Jeremy retrieved a bottle of gin from the cupboard. Fitzgerald, apologising, went aft to see to the starting of the main engines to charge the batteries. Meanwhile, new faces began to appear in the wardroom. "Come in, navigator, and meet your new captain." I shook hands with Tate, a shy, dark-haired junior lieutenant with a soft New Zealand accent. As Jeremy filled the glasses, there was a humming sound, and the boat began to vibrate slightly. The diesels were running, the batteries were charging. Soon Fitzgerald returned to the wardroom with Ellis, the same junior lieutenant who had first greeted me on deck. We were introduced to each other and chatted until the steward appeared to set the table for dinner. Cabt. We decided at once that a week was not necessary for the transfer of business, and the fact that I was an ex-reservist did not play a part here. It was decided to complete all the work in 4 days. The first 2 days, Jeremy would maintain his status as commander, and the next 2 days he would be around to make sure I was in command of the situation. During the normal day's training exercises, we went through every corner of the boat together, and I got a chance to familiarise myself with all the features of its design and equipment in great detail. At the end of the 4th day, we sent messages that I had taken command, after which Jeremy packed up and left for the Cyclops. On the 5th day, it was 5 minutes to 8 in the morning, and I took the bridge as captain of my own ship. I couldn't tell you how it felt. It was a very cold morning, not quite dawn yet. "Good morning, sir," Fitzgerald greeted me. "Good morning, number 1," I replied, trying not to betray my feelings. To hide my expression, I lifted my head and looked up at the sky. It was grey and very gloomy. "All aboard, sir," Fitzgerald reported. "Bow and engine room hatches closed, main engines ready to start, horizontal rudders checked, steering gear checked, telegraphs checked." I went to the bridge railing, climbed a step and leaned on the handrail, as I thought that if I didn't, the mate would be sure to notice my hands shaking. A set of sounds came from the intercom, which Fitzgerald immediately translated as a message of full readiness. "Fine," I said. "Then command the bow end." "Give me the bow end," ordered Fitzgerald, followed by, "Give the stern end." As the mooring ends were pulled into the ship with a clang, I looked around to make sure I was clear of the mooring. One of the H-class submarines was just making a U-turn, and in a few minutes the way would be clear. The boat ahead of me was also pulling away from the dock. We need to move out, or I'll have to wait for her to pass. I began to give the orders usual when a ship is departing the pier, trying my best to keep my voice calm. The lower rank standing at the telegraph turned the handle, a bell echoed softly somewhere below, and at the same moment Fitzgerald spoke in a slightly anxious voice. "Obey the telegraph, sir." That meant that I had forgotten to transmit an important order to the engine room. "Yes, of course, to obey the telegraph," I said hastily, feeling terribly angry at my forgetfulness and instantly incompetent. To make up for the embarrassment, I immediately gave the following order: helmsman 30 degrees starboard. A slight vibration announced that the left propeller had started. Looking around, I could see the wave it was making. We moved toward the exit of the bay. At this end of the bay, the waves were running merrily toward the opposite shore. To make the turn, we had to turn the stern as close to the shallow water as possible, then turn almost in place. I was terribly worried, but the difficult manoeuvre was performed, and we lay on a course to the first buoy and the beginning of the approach channel. Approximately in a cable ahead of us turned to the left, N33, taking a course to the line of buoys, marking the exit to the open sea. 2 other boats were manoeuvring behind us. I did not change course until we were on the right side of the channel, because I had not forgotten how we had run aground here 2 years earlier on the H-28. The day we spent in sight of the shore was one of the most unpleasant of my life. The mooring ends had already been put away in their places. Sailors were climbing one by one from the deck to the bridge and down to the fighting deck house. Ellis, who was in charge of the forward mooring party, was the last to go up and reported that everything was secured and ready for sinking. It was to be hoped that he was not mistaken, for a rope trailing the boat out to sea could cause a lot of trouble during the dive, for example, by coiling around the propeller or horizontal rudder. On the traverse of Devar Lighthouse, we set course for the training area. "Navigator, course?" I asked as we passed Kilbrennan Sound. "Course 78 degrees, sir." Tate had his answer ready. "All right, helmsman, course 78 degrees. When the boat was on a 78-degree course, I leaned over the intercom again. "Control, stand by to change to lower helm. All ready, sir." Switch to lower helm, heading 78 degrees. The bridge helmsman who got a break went below, and I told Tate I was going to go down and have breakfast too. He stayed on the bridge, having been instructed to call me when the exercise area was 1 mile away. I looked around once more. The day was as dreary as the morning. Far ahead, the hills of Arran loomed dimly over the troubled sea. Following us, we could see other submarines heading for different areas of the exercise. After making sure everything was quiet, I went downstairs and joined the rest of the officers, who were paying their respects with scrambled eggs and bacon. So far, everything was going well. When a sailor came into the wardroom and reported that we were 1 mile from our destination, I returned to the bridge and ordered the speed to be reduced and the buoys to be thrown out. We towed 3 small orange-coloured signal buoys behind us on the end of a long line so that the instructors training the sonar operators could visually record our position. The second helmsman tossed the buoys to leeward and etched the line to move them astern. He carefully watched the tension of the line so that the resulting loop would not entangle the propeller or the aft horizontal rudders. This work required a lot of experience, even in moderate waves. Now the Admiralty trawler was catching up with us. This was the ship for which we were to work as a wind-up mouse. Sonar operators were trained on it. He signalled instructions to us, dive time and required course. We took our seats and switched from diesels to electric motors. I gave the signalman the command to blare ready, and a few seconds later a large black flag was raised on the trawler's mast. That was the signal for us to dive. "Everybody down," I said. My heart was pounding so hard that I feared I might not be heard, but I tried very hard to appear calm. Tate and the signalman went below. I leaned over the intercom and said, "Black flag is up. It was time to go." Then I too went down the hatch, pressed the howler button, closed and locked the hatch, and descended the bottom step of the gangway to the control room as the depth gauge arrow crept up to the 10-foot mark. Close the bottom cover, 80 feet, raise the periscope. The first thing I did was make sure the buoys were floating astern and clearly visible. They were bouncing merrily on the waves. When we passed the 32-foot mark, the periscope went under water, and I could no longer see anything but green water. "Put the periscope away." We were slowly sinking into deeper water. 40 feet, 50, 70. At 80 feet, the boat levelled off. Everything was running smoothly. Thus began for me again the work that had become familiar when I was a junior officer in this training flotilla 2 years earlier. Every morning, leaving the harbour, going to the training area, diving to 80 feet, surfacing after 2 tedious hours underwater, diving again, surfacing. That's 6 days out of 7. Sometimes the monotonous routine was interrupted by accidents that caused general laughter or added to our grey hairs. Once, during a dive, the combat cabin began to flute because the flap of the intercom, the voice trumpet, had been left open. In all British submarines, the voice pipe leads from the bridge directly into the control room, and if you do not close the flap on the bridge, nothing significant will happen because the flap in the control room when diving is always closed. One of the many features of the P555 was the voice pipe branch leading into the control room. I forgot to close the flap on the bridge, and the signalman forgot to close the one in the deck house. The result was flooding. It was quite unpleasant in itself, and then the anchor fastener suddenly flew, and the anchor chain stretched out to its full length. I had never encountered such an abnormal situation before. This incident seemed very funny to me. The submarine is floating underwater, the sea is splashing in the combat deck house, the buoys stretch behind the stern, dancing on the waves, and the anchor dangles somewhere below, hanging on a long chain, like a clockwork pendulum. I realize I was being silly, but I couldn't help laughing, and when I had laughed, I ordered Fitzgerald to surface. Another time we were surfacing at high speed for training firing, and the mechanic operating the valves controlling the blowing of the tanks reported that he could not blow the number 3 main ballast tank because the valve was broken. We found ourselves in a position where the forward part of the ship had sufficient buoyancy, and the aft part had none. The gun crew had already opened the hatch covers in preparation to jump out on deck, and the stern was still under water. The water was splashing near the coamings of the upper hatch, ready to rush into the deck house, and I did not dare to reduce speed, lest the stern should sink deeper. We got over the situation soon enough, but we were worried. There was a case when, for some unknown reason, the bow torpedo tube covers were left open. This resulted in a severe bow trim during the dive, which caused us to drop up to 150 feet before we mastered the situation. I must confess that once, while returning to the harbour after a training exercise, I mistakenly skipped the dock and crashed into a row of smacks carefully placed side by side in front of us. The noise was obscenely loud, and I decided that my career as a submarine commander had come to an ignominious end. When we got out of the tangle of cables and ropes and moored the submarine to the dock, I decided to go to the fishermen and apologize to the skippers for the mess. They were sitting over a bottle of gin and were unaware that an extraordinary event had occurred. With a sigh of relief, I began to think of a way around this unfortunate episode in my report to my command. Very soon everyone forgot about it. My life became much more pleasant when in April in Campbelltown arrived Tony Spender on the H-class boat, and then Freddie Sherwood, who commanded the received on Lend-Lease the same as mine, an American submarine. His R-5556 became famous for incessant breakdowns of machinery and equipment, and even earned the nickname unsalvageable. My crew was constantly changing, which was common in this flotilla. Before the end of April, Fitzgerald and Tate left us. As previously arranged, they joined Jeremy Nash in command of a new U-class submarine. I was very reluctant to part with them, but they were replaced by excellent officers, Jeff Stewart as chief mate and Brian Mills as navigator. We worked so well together that I decided to ask command to send them to me if I was ever given a combat submarine. By the end of May, I was desperately bored with our training activities, and when early in June we were sent north to Tobermory to work as a wind-up mousie there, the wheeled beauty of Mull and the matchless nature of the Hebrides did not improve my bad mood. It was more interesting here, though. The surface ships were now new frigates and corvettes, undergoing their final trials before going to sea as escort ships for Atlantic convoys. They had better sonar, so we were diving without signal buoys and setting our own course. This gave me a unique chance to learn how to evade surface hunters, which I did with great zeal. I tried every trick I could think of: the usual zigzag, a sudden change of course, a brief sudden increase in speed, and later I always tried to find out which of my manoeuvres had put the sea hunters in a difficult position. Success was evident if we did not hear the surface ship for 5 or 10 minutes. Then the sound of a small underwater shell bursting was usually heard, which meant that we were lost and must locate ourselves by means of a smoke candle. This is a small container fired by compressed air from a hull-mounted gun. It flew to the surface and let off a jet of white smoke. Such candles were also used to indicate the course of the surfacing submarine. When 2 pieces were released at 5-minute intervals, they showed what course the submarine surfaced and signalled surface ships to clear the space. In mid-June came the order, which I waited with great impatience. I was appointed in command of item number J3067, which was being completed at Camel Yards in Birkenhead. I knew it was an S-class boat like Saracen, and I was over the moon. I couldn't have dreamed of anything more. At Tobermory, Sinji Anderson arrived to take my place, and after turning in to him, I got ready to go. As the steamer for Oban was leaving very early, I said goodbye to the officers and sailors the day before, and asked the chief mate to spare 2 sailors to take me by dinghy to the wharf in the morning. I woke up in the dark, dressed, trying not to disturb anyone, went to the bridge and went down to the deck. A dinghy was waiting for me, with 3 officers at the oars. I was very touched by this traditional but nevertheless unexpected sign of attention, and felt sad. After all, this ship had been my home for a long time. In addition, everything around me suddenly seemed surprisingly beautiful. The bay, sleeping peacefully in these early hours, the trees descending to the water's edge, and even spitting out puffs of black smoke steamer, on which I was to make the first leg of the journey to my new submarine. On a hot and sweltering morning in late June, I entered the gates of Camel Laird's. I was eager to see my new boat and, without even informing the administration of my arrival, I immediately went to the main pool to see her. She was standing against the southeast wall of the same dock where I had found Saracen a year ago. My treasure was called Storm. In the muddy water, the boat sat very high because it was so far very light. But it was, without a doubt, a submarine. It had a rounded, elongated hull with bulging ballast tanks. At first glance, it looked to me like it was a long way from completion. The massive bronze periscope struts were in place, and the 3-inch gun was also in place. But the optical part of the periscopes had not yet been mounted. The plating had not even been started. The net cable had not been stretched, and the bridge had only just begun. Thick and thin cables were snaking everywhere. They entangled the hull, dropped into every hatch, providing temporary lighting and power for the welders and riveters. On wooden logs, anchored at waterline level to keep the hull from banging against the dock wall, stood workers doing something with the ballast tanks. Among the people scurrying around, I recognized a few people I knew. We had met the previous summer. I stood in the sun under a large quay crane, listened to the familiar metallic symphony of the shipyard, looked at my beauty, and felt proud and happy. A thin, blonde-haired man in a protective helmet separated from the group of people gathered at the bow hatch and came toward me. I recognized at once Mr. Morgan, the general manager, the genial coordinator of the mess and confusion misleadingly called ship construction. We stood side by side for a while, discussing the new features that had appeared over the past year in the S-class boats. Storm differed from Saracen in that it had radar, air conditioning units, and an Oerlikon. But another change caused an unexpected delay in the construction program. Not more than a week ago came an Admiralty instruction to convert one of the ballast tanks into a fuel tank, thereby increasing the submarine's range by several hundred miles. This news confirmed what I had heard from Jackie Slaughter on the Cyclops. All the new submarines were designed for operations in the Far East, where the distances from base to patrol area were much greater than we were used to. Putting aside for a while the inspection of my wonderful new toy, I went in search of my mechanical engineer. I knew his name was W. Ray, and he had recently been promoted to warrant officer. I had not had the opportunity to meet him before. I hoped that we would work together. It was very important that we work together. I walked down a long hallway past glass doors until I saw a sign on one of them that read, Storm Engineering Office. Inside, someone was sitting and typing slowly on a typewriter. I opened the door and entered. A long bench set along one wall was covered with binders, charts and diagrams, on top of which were ink bottles, stacks of paper, rubber stamps, boxes of paper clips, buttons and all sorts of clerical stuff. A small safe was in the corner, and toolboxes stood neatly against the wall. On a rack hung an officer's cap and a warrant engineer's uniform tunic. As I entered, the man behind the desk stopped typing and stood looking at me questioningly. He was quite tall and looked younger than I had realized. He had a pleasant, open face and thick, slightly curly hair. Making sure it was Ray, I introduced myself, explaining to the young man that I was his new commander. It was obvious he hadn't heard who would be in command of the boat. I saw his eyes linger on the wavy patches on my sleeve and noticed the look of disappointment that flashed across his face. But he instantly pulled himself together, walked over and said a polite hello. It wasn't a good start. In a way, I understood him. He had been overseeing the construction of the Storm for months. He'd been all over her when she didn't even look like a boat yet. He'd seen her launched. Slowly sliding off the slip, she bobbed on the water, looking more like an empty barrel. Then she was towed to the pool where she was now. He watched the installation of electric motors, diesel engines and batteries, the construction of an extensive network of piping, electrical equipment. He looked inside every tank, familiarized himself with every orifice, every nook and cranny of the submarine. Storm was his brainchild and a source of his legitimate pride, and he subconsciously expected to hand it over to the hands of an Iron Man, a real sea wolf. Instead, an unrepresentable lieutenant from the volunteer reserve showed up and was going to lead his priceless submarine into the open sea. Most likely he was experiencing the natural antagonism of the professional toward the amateur. But there was nothing more I could do. Time would tell how well-founded his concerns were, but in the meantime we had a lot of work to do. Ray briefed me on the current state of affairs. We looked at drawings of the new radar mast and the mechanism by which it is raised and lowered. Then he sketched on a scrap of paper a diagram of the conversion of ballast tank number 4 into a fuel tank. I listened very attentively, but soon felt an irresistible desire to have another look at the Storm, and suggested to my interlocutor to go to the boat together and examine it. By this time I sensed that Ray was beginning to thaw. Now his tone was not only polite, but also cordial. For a few minutes we admired our beauty standing on the dock. Then we walked down the narrow gangway to the deck and descended into the forward hatch. The midday sun heated the hull of the boat, and the heat inside seemed unbearable. It was also quite difficult to walk around inside, having to squeeze between people working in the confined space. We walked along bare steel decks, trying to dodge dangling wires, carefully avoiding pipes, toolboxes, welding machines and other obstacles stacked everywhere. The temporary lighting was not bright, but I could see that the work was far from finished and felt my mood lighten. I couldn't believe that all this chaos would be over in 6 weeks, as Morgan had assured me. "They won't make the deadline, Chief," I said sadly, as we reached the control station. But the Chief, who knew very well how much had been done since the boat had been launched, seemed pleased with the progress of the work. "The boat will be ready in time," he said. We went up the gangway into the fighting deck house and from there out onto the built part of the bridge. I tried to imagine myself on that bridge in a few months. During the next combat campaign, my submarine would surface at night and move along the enemy shore, lifting her bow on a wave, then lowering it into the water. By that time, she will have a past and her own unique personality. Right now, She is just a collection of separate steel structures that do not yet work together in obedience to a common purpose. For her, history will begin when she goes to sea in her car. The official programme had the following item: August 10th, Tuesday, Siktar. Out of the pool into the river. Sea trials. Upon completion, proceed to Tower Dockyard. August 10th was exactly 6 weeks away. I was pessimistic again, expressing my belief that the builders would not finish the work in time to meet the deadline. They did. The last few weeks were a living hell. I had already had a similar experience on the Saracen. I had to order and check the arrival of 1,000 different things, to follow the testing of all systems and devices. I had to give up the mounted, powerful periscope because I noticed 2 spots on one of the lenses. But the periscope sent to replace it was above reproach. It was necessary to get acquainted with the incoming crew members, organise watches, training. Besides, I remembered the methods I had once used in practice to persuade the workers and masters of the dock to meet us and install some useful details, which made life in practice very easy. It turned out that these methods could be used repeatedly. Having received word that the helmsmen and sailors would be arriving shortly, I decided it was time to take care of the missing officers and sent out a request for Jeff Stewart as chief mate and Brian Mills as navigator. The torpedo officer I got was a young Leet R. Wade, also from the volunteer reservists. He was a reliable officer, but had no submarine experience. Stewart and Mills had little experience either, so compared to them, I felt like a veteran. We took over the ship on July 9th, and a noisy and crowded party was organised for the occasion. I had sent an invitation to Admiral Max Horton, a famous submarine hero who had made a name for himself during the First World War. He was the commander-in-chief of the Navy's Western Group at the time. He replied that he would not be able to attend the celebration, but he would definitely pay a visit to the submarine 2 days later. It turned out even better. The Admiral drove up in a large car driven by a very beautiful female officer from the Auxiliary Corps. After going around the premises of the boat, the Admiral and his lovely driver sat with us in the wardroom for half an hour. He told us a few incidents from his rich practice. Once, while evading pursuers, his boat lay on the bottom at a depth of about 150 feet. He decided to get some rest and went to bed, leaving one of the officers on watch. A few hours later he awoke and immediately sensed something was wrong. It seemed to him that the boat was rocking slightly. He went into the control room and made sure the depth gauge showed 150 feet. Then he tapped the gauge and was horrified to see the arrow quickly jump to 0. "Raise the periscope!" he yelled, and found his boat floating serenely on the surface of the sea in broad daylight. Thankfully there was no one around. Now, as far as I knew, Max Horton was making a Herculean effort to turn the tide of the war in the Atlantic and defeat the German submarines. Saying goodbye, he wished me luck and joked, "Thank your lucky star, boy, that you're not in command of a German submarine." On the evening of August 10th, at 10 minutes to 6, I stood on the bridge and watched the sailors on deck preparing to give up the moorings. The 11-hour fuss of loading the ship was safely over. The last few days had been equally hectic. They seemed to merge into one foggy, fuzzy picture, like what you see in a telescope before the last turn of the lens turns a blurry blur into a clear image. 2 weeks ago, I firmly believed that the remaining work would take at least several months to complete. But Camel Laird's could work miracles. And now the submarine Storm had finally taken on the appearance of His Majesty's submarine. She glistened with fresh dark grey paint, showed everyone her number P233 written on the side of the combat deckhouse in white numerals as tall as a man, and proudly carried on the mast a brand new flag of the British Navy. Number 1 stood at the intercom, giving orders and listening to reports, the telegraph tinkling businesslike. The ship was coming to life. All the officers and sailors felt the importance of the moment, although there was no official ceremony. I don't think even the chief was able to keep an indifferent face when he first went up to the bridge to report on the readiness of the main engines. There was a tugboat waiting for us in the middle of the pool, ready to come to our aid if anything went wrong. The gates were opened, and a light ripple from the river disturbed the stagnant water of the basin. Several labourers stood on the wharf wall. They had finished their work at the very last moment, and were now watching the ship they had built go to sea for the first time. On the bridge stood the pilot, whose presence was mandatory, and Morgan, who wanted to make sure that his brainchild would behave and that the new captain would not hurt it by smashing it against the pool wall, for example. I was fully aware of my responsibility for this fantastically complex ship, which had cost $300,000 to build, but I was calm and confident. We were ready. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening I gave the first order. With a loud splash, the ends holding the ship to the quay fell into the water. They will now be pulled ashore by the workmen. Helmsman, 30 degrees to port. The boat was at the pier, with its port side and its bow turned to the opposite side of the river. We were now to bring the stern almost to the centre of the basin, to then execute a turn in place and exit the gate. The task was clear, and I set to work. While we were in the basin, no diesels could be used. All manoeuvres were done on electric motors only. It all worked out quite easily, and now the bow of the submarine was staring exactly into the middle of the gate. When you're near the helmsman, there's no point in jerking him around with constant course instructions in degrees. It's better to let him do his job quietly. "All right, helmsman," I said, "steer her straight down the centre." Chief Petty Officer Wells was a phlegmatic and imperturbable big fellow. He seemed to me to be pleased with the confidence placed in him. We passed the gate at 5 knots and went out into the River Mersey on high water. I wish I were able to describe the magical, delightful feeling when a new ship, for which you are responsible, first stepped off the quay and glided smoothly through the water. I stood on the bridge at the Periscope towers, watched the movement of other ships, looked at the map, enjoyed the fresh breeze that pleasantly cooled my face, and with all my being felt the enormity of the submarine, pushed by the propellers through the water column. The quay with cranes and scaffolding was already behind us, and soon we saw the Royal Cliff Hotel standing on the shore, where we officers had been living for the last few weeks. Taking advantage of Aldis's lamp, we beeped a greeting in the direction of the hotel, hoping to be noticed by Mr. and Mrs. Gladstone. Soon it was time to change course. Shifting the rudder to the left as far as it would go, we headed downstream again. There were hardly any boats around, so we decided to try and start the diesels. They started on the first try and behaved so perfectly that we couldn't help but give the chief credit. We motored the diesels downstream towards the Alfred Lock. The tall buildings of Liverpool were already showing up ahead. Here we switched to electric motors to enter the lock. There was a rather treacherous whirlpool at the entrance, but the pilot had warned me of the danger beforehand. I had time to assess the situation correctly and steered the ship perfectly. We stopped the cars at the slippery wall of the sluice, and Morgan, breathing a noticeable sigh of relief, said loudly, "Well done, Captain. I think the pleasure even made me blush." After passing through the lock, we moored at the pier of the Tower shipyard. Here we spent 3 days while the demagnetization experts tried to keep us at least temporarily safe from magnetic mines. We took the opportunity to bring all personal belongings aboard and do a general cleaning. Early in the morning of August 14th, we were to sail for the Clyde and join the 3rd submarine flotilla at Dunoon. The sloop Cutty Sark had already arrived to escort us into the Irish Sea. And on the evening of August 13th, an unexpected obstacle was discovered. During the final check of all moving parts, carried out in preparation for the dive for trim, which we were obliged to perform as soon as we put to sea, it was discovered that the stern horizontal rudders were not moving. It was very important that these planes function properly because they are what keep the boat at depth when moving underwater. The only possible explanation is that the glands, for which some new materials had been used, had swollen and hardened, jamming the shafts. The only way out of this situation was to put the Storm in dry dock. This meant that our going to sea would be postponed for at least a week. Extremely annoyed, I went to the Cutty Sark to break the sad news to all concerned. The situation was aggravated by the fact that it was impossible to live on a submarine in dry dock, and we had already vacated rooms in the hotel and boarding house for sailors. It was urgent to get on with the accommodation of the men, as most of the sailors' rooms had already been given up. The officers returned again to the Royal Cliff Hotel, where the Gladstone couple had ceremoniously seen us off only 2 days before. They greeted us with their usual friendliness and even managed to accommodate us somehow, but we felt very uncomfortable. Early on Saturday morning, August 21st, we followed the Cutty Sark towards the Clyde. At the Bar Lighthouse we landed the pilot, put out into the open sea, and began to prepare for our first dive. Morgan and 3 or 4 other engineers from Camel Leads were on board. Before the dive, they decided to back up and do the usual vacuum test. They closed the hatch of the war room and turned on the air compressors for a few minutes to create a partial vacuum in the submarine. If it persisted for 5 minutes, it meant that there were no serious leaks in the hull or around the hatch coamings. We stopped the diesels and slowly went forward on only one electric motor. I stayed on the bridge in company with the forward lookout and helmsman, while the rest of the crew were draped below and had a very uncomfortable feeling in their ears. We travelled almost silently on the mirror-like surface of the water, like a ghost ship guided by an invisible crew. It was strange to be standing on the bridge of a submarine in broad daylight, with the hatches battened down and the voice box sealed shut, feeling cut off from the 50 men sealed in the steel hull. I sent Signalman Robinson to fix a large red flag on the aft periscope, signifying preparations for a dive. Soon a sound from the voice trumpet heralded the end of the test. The lower hatch in the control room was opened and air rushed into the tube to fill the vacuum. Soon the bridge hatch opened. Morgan emerged from it and reported that the test had been a success. The submarine was ready for its first dive. I ordered the signalman to transmit a message to Cutty Sark. Preparing to dive for trim. Towing buoys. Speed about 4 knots. Surface in about 10 minutes. While the signalman relayed the information, I called Petty Officer Blythe, the second helmsman, to the bridge to get the buoys ready. These, like the red flag on the aft periscope tower, were to indicate our location to Cutty Sark. We had 3 orange buoys on a rope long enough for the buoys to float to the surface, even if we had an accident and the boat sank to the bottom. The sea was calm, and the helmsman had no trouble dropping the buoys astern so that the tow rope was a safe distance from the propellers. Meanwhile, we switched from steering on the bridge to steering from the station. "Message passed," reported the signalman. They responded by wishing us good luck. And then came the great moment. I ordered everyone off the bridge, personally closed the vocal tube openings, and cast a parting glance at the Cutty Sark, which was manoeuvring to take position on our left traverse. I took the first step toward the hatch. There was no hurry. No one was standing overhead with a stopwatch on this dive. I had no intention of diving on a howler signal, and the crew was not yet experienced enough. I closed the hatch cover and locked it carefully. The deckhouse smelled of fresh paint. As I walked down the gangway, I felt a pleasant excitement far removed from the uncertainty and anxiety that had accompanied me on my first dive on the R555E5. In the control room, warm light flooded the freshly painted walls, new furniture and instruments. People in white suits were in their seats. The signalman climbed up the gangway and closed the hatch leading to the battle room. I glanced at Jeff, noting that his normally pale face had taken on a bluish tint, and asked if everything was ready. He replied, trying to remain calm, that everything was ready. Then I ordered the periscope to be raised. As we were still on the surface, it rose 32 feet above the water. I had the impression that I was looking down from a great height. The Cutty Sark was 3 cable feet away on the port beam. Her entire crew seemed to be on deck to see our first dive. Turning the upper lenses slightly, I could see the bow of the Storm. Deploy the bow rudders. Located at the front of the ship, The horizontal rudders, unlike the stern rudders, are a few feet above the waterline. On the surface, they are usually folded up so as not to be damaged in a swell. I watched through the periscope as they slowly unfolded, stretching out to the sides like arms open for a hug. Remembering the trouble with the stern rudders, I decided to make sure they were okay before diving. "Check the bow and stern rudders, number 1, I said. I then carefully watched as the bow rudders rotated from the dive position to the surfacing position and back to the centre position. "All right," Stewart reported. "All right, ready, Mr. Morgan?" "Ready, Captain." "Small forward, open main valves, dive to 30 feet. And so began our first dive. A more exciting moment can only be the first encounter with the enemy. But I was the only one who felt the full force of the dive. Everyone else was watching the depth gauges, and I did not leave the periscope and saw how the submarine made its way through the water column. And when the main valves opened, she lowered the nose and rushed down. The water quickly filled the flooded spaces and expelled the air that bubbled out through the perforations along the deck. I thought for a second that I was on the back of a huge sea monster, which had come up to the surface for some reason and was now confidently seeking its habitat. The nose rudders were pointing downward like fins. Confidently cutting the water and raising columns of spray, they carried the submarine into the depths. Now the deck was already hidden under water, and the last air bubbles rushed to the surface. Very soon, only the net rope was left above water, but even it soon found itself under the mirror-like surface. For some reason, I suddenly wanted to hold my breath, as if I had missed the beginning of the tide, and now I was standing on a lonely cliff, and the water was rising fast and about to cover my face, preventing me from breathing. I turned away from the periscope. A quick glance at the instruments showed that the chief mate had everything under control. We were levelling off at the required depth. Storm was finally a real submarine.